Which South American country experienced a dirty war from 1976 to 1983? Argentina. Who was president of South Africa at the end of apartheid? F.W. de Klerk. What was the 1994 agreement that ended decades of apartheid? South Africa's first multiracial elections. Who was the Chinese leader after Mao Zedong's death who promoted economic reforms? Deng Xiaoping. Which African country was colonized by Belgium until 1960? Democratic Republic of Congo, formerly Zaire. Who became the president of Poland after leading the Solidarity movement? Lech Walesa. Which country underwent a violent conflict known as the Troubles? Northern Ireland, UK. Which Latin American country experienced the Zapatista uprising in 1994? Mexico. Who was the leader of Libya during the 2011 Arab Spring uprisings? Muammar Gaddafi. What treaty established peace between Egypt and Israel in 1979? Camp David Accords. Who became President of the United States in January 2009? Barack Obama. What was the agreement signed in 1998 to end the conflict in Northern Ireland? Good Friday Agreement. Who led Ethiopia during its 1935 invasion by Italy? Haile Selassie. What was the US policy of supporting any nation threatened by communism called? Truman Doctrine. Who was the leader of Spain during the Spanish Civil War and World War II? Francisco Franco. Which international organization was created in 1949 as a military alliance of Western countries? NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Who succeeded Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister of the UK? John Major. Which Middle Eastern country saw a civil war beginning in 2011? Syria. Who was Prime Minister of Canada during World War II? William Lyon Mackenzie King. Which international agreement attempted to limit nuclear proliferation in 1968? Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT. Who became the first president of Indonesia after independence? Sukarno. What event marked the end of the Cold War symbolically in 1989? Fall of the Berlin Wall. Who became the US president after Gerald Ford? Jimmy Carter. What major conflict occurred in Southeast Asia involving US troops from 1965 to 1973? Vietnam War. Who was the first Prime Minister of Israel? David Ben-Gurion. Which country gained independence from Indonesia after a referendum in 1999? East Timor. Who led India during the Indo-Pakistani War of 1971? Indira Gandhi. What was the US invasion of Cuba by Cuban exiles in 1961 called? Bay of Pigs invasion. Who became leader of Zimbabwe after independence in 1980? Robert Mugabe. Which international treaty attempted to reduce greenhouse gases signed in 1997? Kyoto Protocol. Who became the first leader of independent Tunisia in 1957? Habib Bourguiba. What was the 1949 military alliance of communist Eastern European countries called? Warsaw Pact. What event marked the reunification of Germany in 1990? German Reunification Treaty. Who was Prime Minister of Britain during the miners' strike of 1984-1985? Margaret Thatcher. Which Asian country was ruled by military dictator Park Chung-hee until 1979? South Korea. Who became Chancellor of Germany after Angela Merkel? Olaf Scholz. What major treaty ended World War I for Austria-Hungary? Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. Who was the British monarch during World War II? King George V. Which country experienced a revolution led by Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979? Iran. Who was the president of Serbia during the Kosovo War? Slobodan Milosevic. What year marked the dissolution of Yugoslavia? In the year 1992. Who was Prime Minister of India at the time of the Kargil War in 1999? Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Who became President of South Africa following Nelson Mandela in 1999? Thabo Mbeki. What was the crisis in the late 1990s that involved ethnic cleansing and NATO bombing in the Balkans? Kosovo War. Who was the US President during the Berlin airlift of 194,849? Harry S. Truman. Which country gained independence from British rule in 1957 as the Federation of Malaya? Malaysia. Who led the African National Congress during the struggle against apartheid? Nelson Mandela. What was the treaty signed in 1992 establishing free trade among the US, Canada, and Mexico? North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. Who was the Prime Minister of Israel during the 1982 Lebanon War? Menahem Begin. Which Asian country was ruled by dictator Chun Do-hwan from 1980 to 1988? South Korea. Who became the first democratically elected president of Afghanistan after the fall of the Taliban? Hamid Karzai. What year did India and Pakistan become independent nations? In the year 1947. Who was the leader of Iran during the 1980-88 war with Iraq? Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Which African nation saw civil war break out in 2013, shortly after independence in 2011? South Sudan. Who became Prime Minister of Britain after Margaret Thatcher? John Major. What was the military operation that captured Saddam Hussein in 2003 called? Operation Red Dawn. Who was the Chinese Communist Party leader who oversaw the Tiananmen Square crackdown in 1989? Deng Xiaoping. Which African country faced a civil war involving UNITA rebels until 2002? Angola. Who became president of Venezuela after Hugo Chavez's death in 2013? Nicolas Maduro. What agreement established peace between Israel and Jordan in 1994? Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty. Who was the first leader of independent Malawi? Hastings Banda. Which country experienced the Orange Revolution in 2004-2005? Ukraine. Who was the president of South Korea during the Sunshine Policy towards North Korea? Kim Dae-jung. What major nuclear disaster occurred in Japan in 2011? Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster. Who became the US President after Bill Clinton? George W. Bush. What conflict erupted in Darfur, Sudan, starting in 2003? Darfur conflict. Who was the President of Russia during the annexation of Crimea in 2014? Vladimir Putin. Which Asian country underwent a revolution in 1986 that removed Ferdinand Marcos? The Philippines. Who became Prime Minister of Canada after Stephen Harper in 2015? Justin Trudeau. What was the insurgency movement that fought against Soviet forces in Afghanistan in the 1980s? Mujahideen. Who became President of Chile after Augusto Pinochet's rule ended in 1990? Patricio Aylwin. Which European nation was the site of the Srebrenica massacre in 1995? Bosnia and Herzegovina. Who was the Cuban leader before Fidel Castro's revolution in 1959? Fulgencio Batista. Which international treaty signed in 1975 aimed at improving relations between Eastern and Western Europe? Helsinki Accords. Who became President of France in 2017? Emmanuel Macron. Which Asian country saw an uprising in 1988 resulting in a military crackdown and thousands killed? Myanmar, Burma. Who was Prime Minister of Britain when Hong Kong was handed back to China in 1997? Tony Blair. What event was the site of a major pro-democracy protest in Hong Kong in 2014? Umbrella Movement. Who became President of Brazil after Dilma Rousseff's impeachment in 2016? Michel Temer. What international agreement, signed in 1994, aimed to end apartheid in South Africa? South Africa's interim constitution, leading to multiracial elections. Who became Prime Minister of India after Rajiv Gandhi's assassination? P.V. Narasimha Rao. Which African nation saw a civil war from 1991 to 2002 involving the Revolutionary United Front, RUF? Sierra Leone. Who was the leader of Serbia during the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s? Slobodan Milosevic. What year did East and West Germany officially reunify? In the year 1990. Who became leader of Zimbabwe after Robert Mugabe resigned in 2017? Emerson Mnangagwa. Which international organization replaced GATT in 1995 to supervise global trade? World Trade Organization, WTO. Who was the president of the Philippines during the war on drugs beginning in 2016? Rodrigo Duterte. Which country saw a velvet divorce in 1993 resulting in its peaceful split? Czechoslovakia. Who became Prime Minister of Australia in 2007, ending John Howard's tenure? Kevin Rudd. What event in 1989 led to significant democratic reforms in Poland? Round Table Talks. Who was the Soviet leader during the establishment of the Berlin Wall in 1961? Nikita Khrushchev. Which African country was the first to gain independence from colonial rule in 1951? Libya. Who became the leader of North Korea after Kim Jong-il's death in 2011? Kim Jong-un. What major international climate agreement was reached in 2015? Paris Agreement. Who was the Egyptian president ousted during the 2011 Arab Spring? Hosni Mubarak. Which Latin American country underwent a military coup led by George Videla in 1976? Argentina. Who was Prime Minister of Japan during World War II end? Kanta Suzuki. Which country became the world's newest nation in 2011? South Sudan. Who became Prime Minister of Israel after Benjamin Netanyahu in 2021? Naftali Bennett. What was the pro-democracy movement in Myanmar after the 2021 military coup called? Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM. Who was the first president of independent Mozambique in 1975? Samora Machel. Which European country faced a debt crisis leading to international bailout starting in 2009? Greece. Who was the Prime Minister of Canada who signed the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982? Pierre Trudeau. Which Asian country fought a civil war from 1983 until 2009 involving the Tamil Tigers? Sri Lanka. Who became Prime Minister of India after Narendra Modi's first term ended in 2019? Narendra Modi, re-elected. Which Latin American country experienced hyperinflation and economic collapse under Nicolas Maduro? Venezuela. Who was the first leader of independent Zambia? Kenneth Kunda. What year did the Brexit referendum take place? In the year 2016. Who became Prime Minister of New Zealand in 2017? Jacinda Ardern. Which African nation experienced civil unrest known as the Arab Spring in 2011 resulting in President Ben Ali's ouster? Tunisia. Who was the longest-serving Chancellor of Germany after World War II? Helmut Kohl. Which international treaty ended the state of war between Germany and the Allied powers after World War II? Treaty on the Final Settlement with Respect to Germany, 1990. Who was the Prime Minister of Italy during the Eurozone debt crisis in 2011? Silvio Berlusconi. Which African nation experienced a severe famine in the mid-1980s? Ethiopia. Who was President of the United States during the Iran-Contra affair? Ronald Reagan. Who became President of Argentina after the end of the military dictatorship in 1983? Raúl Alfonsín. What major event marked the official end of the Ottoman Empire? The abolition of the Caliphate in 1924. Who was the Soviet leader during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962? Nikita Khrushchev. Which African country became independent from Ethiopia in 1993? Eritrea. Who was the first president of post-communist Poland? Lech Walesa. What major uprising occurred in East Germany in June 1953? East German Workers' Uprising. Who became president of South Korea after Park Chung-hee's assassination? Choi Kyun-hah. What was the 1958-1961 campaign in China aimed at rapid industrialization? Great Leap Forward. Who was the first democratically elected president of Haiti in 1991? Jean-Bertrand Aristide. Which Asian country gained independence from British rule in 1948 as Ceylon? Sri Lanka. Who became president of Nigeria after the return to civilian rule in 1999? Olusegun Obasanjo. What international treaty banned landmines, signed in 1997? Ottawa Treaty, Mine Ban Treaty. Who led Zimbabwe's independence movement against British rule? Robert Mugabe. Which European country experienced severe ethnic conflict leading to the Dayton Peace Accords? Bosnia and Herzegovina. Which country underwent an economic transformation known as the Celtic Tiger in the late 20th century? Ireland. Who succeeded Jamal Abdel Nasser as president of Egypt in 1970? Anwar Sadat. What major conflict occurred between Ethiopia and Eritrea from 1998 to 2000? Eritrean-Ethiopian War. Who became president of Colombia after the peace deal with FARC rebels in 2016? Juan Manuel Santos. What was the Soviet policy of restructuring initiated by Gorbachev? Perestroika. Who was president of Iran during the Iranian Revolution in 1979? Abul Hassan Banisadr, first elected president post-revolution. Which Latin American nation was led by Evo Morales from 2006 to 2019? Bolivia. Who was the president of the United States during the signing of NAFTA? Bill Clinton. What international agreement aimed to protect the ozone layer, signed in 1987? Montreal Protocol. Who was the first president of independent Tanzania? Julius Nyerere. Which European leader initiated the policy of Ostpolitik with Eastern Europe in the 1970s? Willy Brandt. Who became Prime Minister of Japan after Shinzo Abe resigned in 2020? Yoshihide Suga. Which South American nation experienced economic collapse and riots in 2001-2002? Argentina. Who led Ghana after Kwame Nkrumah's overthrow in 1966? Joseph Arthur Ngta. What was the international court established in 2002 to prosecute crimes against humanity? International Criminal Court, ICC. Who became president of Chile in 2014, serving her second term? Michelle Bachelet. Which European nation saw the Rose Revolution in 2003? Georgia. Who succeeded Boris Yeltsin as president of Russia in 1999? Vladimir Putin. What year marked the official handover of Macau from Portugal to China? In the year 1999. Who was president of Rwanda after the 1994 genocide? Paul Kagame. Which Southeast Asian country became independent from the United States in 1946? The Philippines. Who was the leader of Bulgaria during the end of communist rule in 1989? Todor Zhivkov. What was the international peace agreement ending the Angolan Civil War in 2002? Luna Memorandum of Understanding. Who became Prime Minister of Italy in 2021? Mario Draghi. Which Asian country faced the 8,888 uprising for democracy in 1988? Myanmar, Burma. Who succeeded Hosni Mubarak as President of Egypt in 2012? Mohammad Morsi. What international agreement aimed at limiting nuclear arms was signed in 1987 by Reagan and Gorbachev? Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF Treaty. Who became Prime Minister of Spain after Francisco Franco's death in 1975? Adolfo Suarez. Which African country experienced the Mau Mau uprising in the 1950s? Kenya. Who was president of Ukraine during the Orange Revolution in 2004? Leonid Kuchma. Viktor Yushchenko was elected afterward. What major peace agreement ended the conflict in Northern Ireland in 1998? Good Friday Agreement. Who was the Prime Minister of Israel during the Second Intifada beginning in 2000? Ehud Barak, initially, followed by Ariel Sharon. Which country saw protests known as the Cedar Revolution in 2005? Lebanon. Who succeeded Kim Il-sung as leader of North Korea in 1994? Kim Jong-il. What major economic crisis affected East Asian economies in 1997? Asian financial crisis. Who was the British Prime Minister during the decolonization of Africa in the late 1950s and early 1960s? Harold Macmillan. What conflict broke out between Georgia and Russia in 2008? Russo-Georgian War. Who became Prime Minister of Pakistan after Nawaz Sharif's removal in 2017? Imran Khan, 2018. Which European country faced economic collapse and received EU bailouts between 2010 and 2018? Greece. Who became the first president of independent Namibia in 1990? Sam Nujoma. Which Latin American country had a civil war from 1960 to 1996 involving indigenous rights? Guatemala. Who became Prime Minister of Israel after Ehud Olmert in 2009? Benjamin Netanyahu. Which African nation saw the Arab Spring lead to Muammar Gaddafi's overthrow in 2011? Libya. Who was the president of France during the May 1968 protests? Charles de Gaulle. What event in 1978 marked a major breakthrough in Egypt-Israel relations? Camp David Accords. Who was the first president of independent Botswana in 1966? Seretse Khama. Which Middle Eastern nation experienced the Cedar Revolution against Syrian influence in 2005? Lebanon. Who became the first president of independent Burundi in 1966? Michel Maikombo. What was the international agreement to reduce greenhouse gases signed in Japan in 1997? Kyoto Protocol. Who became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in July 2019? Boris Johnson. Which South American country faced political unrest and Evo Morales' resignation in 2019? Bolivia. Who was the leader of North Vietnam after Ho Chi Minh's death in 1969? Le Duan. Which international treaty in 1951 established the European Coal and Steel Community? Treaty of Paris. Who was Prime Minister of India when the country tested nuclear weapons in 1998? Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Which Asian country underwent the EDSA People Power Revolution in 1986? The Philippines. Who became the first president of independent Guinea in 1958? Ahmed Sékou Touré. Which African country had a civil war from 2002 to 2007 involving President Laurent Gbagbo? Ivory Coast. Who became president of Afghanistan after Ashraf Ghani fled in 2021? Taliban returned to power. Which event led to the US-led invasion of Afghanistan in 2001? September 11th terrorist attacks. Who was the Prime Minister of Italy during the Moneypolite, Clean Hands, corruption investigations in the 1990? Giuliano Amato. What was the international tribunal created to prosecute war crimes in former Yugoslavia called? International Criminal Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia, ICTY. Who succeeded Juan Perón as President of Argentina in 1974 after his death? Isabel Perón. What was the significant economic and political change in Eastern Europe after communism's collapse called? Transition to market economy, or shock therapy. Who became President of Egypt after Mohamed Morsi was overthrown in 2013? Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. Which country experienced a peaceful revolution in 1989 known as the Singing Revolution? Estonia. Who was the President of Sudan overthrown in 2019 after mass protests? Omar al-Bashir. What year was the euro currency officially introduced into circulation? In the year 2002. Who became the first Prime Minister of independent Singapore in 1965? Lee Kuan Yew. Which African country faced civil war involving President Charles Taylor in the 1990 and early 2000? Liberia. Who was the Prime Minister of Australia during the 2007-2008 global financial crisis? Kevin Rudd. What was the series of protests and uprisings that began across Arab nations in 2011 called? Arab Spring. Who succeeded Fidel Castro as leader of Cuba in 2008? Raúl Castro. Which international treaty established the European Atomic Energy Community in 1957? Euratom Treaty. Who was President of France during the Algerian independence in 1962? Charles de Gaulle. Which Asian country saw political protests known as the Sunflower Movement in 2014? Taiwan. Who became President of Nigeria after Muhammadu Buhari in 2023? Bola Tinubu. What was the US military intervention in Somalia in 19,921,993 known as? Operation Restore Hope. Who became Prime Minister of Ethiopia after Hailemariam Desalegn resigned in 2018? Abiy Ahmed. What international agreement signed in 1948 aimed to codify human rights universally? Universal Declaration of Human Rights, UDHR. Who became the first president of independent Uganda in 1962? Milton Obote. Which South American country faced the Caracazo riots in 1989 due to economic austerity measures? Venezuela. Who was president of Mexico during the signing of NAFTA in 1994? Carlos Salinas de Gortari. What was the 1982 conflict between the United Kingdom and Argentina over disputed islands? Falklands War. Who became Prime Minister of Pakistan after Imran Khan's ousting in 2022? Shehbaz Sharif. Which Asian nation experienced the May 13th race riots in 1969? Malaysia. Who succeeded Ayatollah Khomeini as the supreme leader of Iran in 1989? Ali Khamenei. What was the 1969 war between Honduras and El Salvador called? Football War, or Soccer War? Who was the British Prime Minister during the Profumo scandal in 1963? Harold Macmillan. Which African country experienced civil unrest and mass protests known as the Hirak movement starting in 2019? Algeria. Who became President of France after Jacques Chirac? Nicolas Sarkozy. Which Asian nation saw the 1979 Kozying incident leading to political liberalization? Taiwan. Who was the dictator of Romania executed after the revolution of 1989? Nicolae Ceausescu. Which international agreement aimed at reducing strategic nuclear weapons was signed in 1991? START-I, Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. Who became Prime Minister of Greece after Alexis Tsipras in 2019? Kyriakos Mitsotakis. Which African country saw conflict between Hutus and Tutsis that spilled into neighboring countries in the late 1990s? Democratic Republic of the Congo. Who was the US President during Operation Desert Storm in 1991? George H.W. Bush. Which Latin American nation experienced guerrilla insurgency from the Shining Path in the 1980 and 1990s? Peru. Who became President of Ukraine after the 2014 Euromaidan protests? Petro Poroshenko. What was the major protest movement against economic inequality beginning in 2011? Occupy movement. Who was the President of Venezuela before Hugo Chavez? Rafael Caldera. Which European country saw massive protests called the Revolution of Dignity in 2014? Ukraine. Who was President of Brazil during the 2016 Summer Olympics in Rio de Janeiro? Michel Temer. What year did the Soviet Union officially dissolve into independent states? In the year 1991. Who succeeded Nelson Mandela as President of South Africa? Thabo Mbeki. Which Asian country faced a financial crisis in 1997 that led to IMF intervention? South Korea. Who became the leader of Vietnam after H. Chi Minh's death in 1969? Le Duc. What year was the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, formed following the USSR's collapse? In the year 1991. Who was the dictator of the Philippines overthrown in 1986 People Power Revolution? Ferdinand Marcos. Which African country saw major conflicts involving the SPLA and led to independence in 2011? Sudan, resulting in South Sudan's independence. Who became Prime Minister of Thailand after the 2014 military coup? Prayut Chan-o-cha. What event marked the transition from the Fourth to the Fifth Republic in France in 1958? Algerian crisis and Charles de Gaulle's return. Who became President of Uruguay in 2010, known for his austere lifestyle? José Mujica. Which African country saw the overthrow of Mobutu Sese Seko in 1997? Zaire, Democratic Republic of Congo. Who was Prime Minister of Canada during the 1980 Quebec sovereignty referendum? Pierre Trudeau. What major conflict occurred between Russia and Ukraine beginning in 2014? Russo-Ukrainian War. Who became Prime Minister of India after Indira Gandhi's assassination in 1984? Rajiv Gandhi. Which South American country had an internal armed conflict with guerrilla groups including the ELN and FARC? Colombia. Who succeeded Yitzhak Rabin as Prime Minister of Israel after his assassination in 1995? Shimon Peres. Which European nation underwent the Carnation Revolution in 1974? Portugal. Who became President of Indonesia after Suharto's resignation in 1998? B.J. Habibie. What international agreement was reached in 2015 to limit Iran's nuclear program? Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, Iran Nuclear Deal. Who succeeded Angela Merkel as Chancellor of Germany in 2021? Olaf Scholz. Which Asian country faced protests called the Milk Tea Alliance starting in 2020? Thailand, along with solidarity protests in Hong Kong and Taiwan. Who became the first president of independent Zimbabwe in 1980? Canaan Banana, ceremonial, Robert Mugabe, executive prime minister. What was the name of the Islamist extremist group that seized power in Afghanistan in 2021? The Taliban. Who was the president of Egypt during the 1967 Six-Day War? Jamal Abdel Nasser. Which country underwent a Velvet Revolution in 1989? Czechoslovakia. Who succeeded Salvador Allende as president of Chile after the 1973 coup? Augusto Pinochet. Who was president of Argentina during the Falklands War in 1982? Leopoldo Galtieri. What was the mass killing of civilians by Indonesian troops in East Timor in 1991 known as Santa Cruz Massacre? Who succeeded Margaret Thatcher as leader of the UK Conservative Party? John Major. Which country gained independence from Yugoslavia in 2008? Kosovo. Who became president of the United States after the Watergate scandal? Gerald Ford. What major peace agreement ended the civil war in El Salvador in 1992? Chapultepec Peace Accords. Who led Iran during the presidency from 2005 to 2013, known for controversial statements? Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Which European country experienced the financial troika bailout starting in 2010? Greece. Who was Prime Minister of India during the emergency period? 1,97,51,977. Indira Gandhi. What crisis in 1998 involved the nuclear tests conducted by India and Pakistan? Pokhran II tests. Who was president of Brazil during the economic boom of the early 2000s? Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. What was the revolution against communist rule in Mongolia in 1990 known as Mongolian Democratic Revolution? Who became Prime Minister of Turkey after Bülent Ecevit in 2003? Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Which Asian country had an independence war against Pakistan in 1971? Bangladesh. Who was the military leader who seized power in Uganda in 1971? Idi Amin. What event in 1973 led to severe global oil shortages? OPEC oil embargo. Who succeeded Yasser Arafat as leader of the Palestinian Authority in 2005? Mahmoud Abbas. Which European country saw the Tulip Revolution in 2005? Kyrgyzstan. Who was president of Argentina during the Falklands War? Leopoldo Galtieri. Which African country was ruled by dictator Mobutu Sese Seko from 1965 to 1997? Zaire, Democratic Republic of the Congo. Who became president of South Africa after Thabo Mbeki in 2008? Kgalema Motlanthe, interim, followed by Jacob Zuma in 2009. Which country experienced the 2007 Saffron Revolution against military rule? Myanmar, Burma. Who was the Prime Minister of Japan during the Plaza Accord in 1985? Yasuhiro Nakazone. What was the campaign of political repression in Argentina from 1976 to 1983 known as Dirty War? Who became the president of Russia in 2008, succeeding Vladimir Putin temporarily? Dmitry Medvedev. Which treaty ended the war between Italy and the Allies after World War II? Treaty of Paris, 1947. Who was the first president of independent Guinea-Bissau in 1973? Luis Cabral. Which Asian country experienced the People Power II revolution in 2001? The Philippines. Who was president of France during the establishment of the Fifth Republic in 1958? Charles de Gaulle. Which country experienced the Cedar Revolution after Rafiq Hariri's assassination in 2005? Lebanon. Who succeeded Kim Jong-il as the leader of North Korea in 2011? Kim Jong-un. What major global financial event occurred on October 19, 1987? Black Monday stock market crash.